There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Olivia Liddell. Olivia is a solutions architect at Amazon Web Services. Over the course of her career, she's created innovative teaching and technical training solutions for learners from diverse backgrounds and skill levels. As a certified ethical hacker, Olivia frequently speaks on topics such as social engineering and security awareness. In her spare time, she enjoys distance running, studying linguistic anthropology, and developing web applications for Arabic language learners. Today, we're talking about serverless architecture and how using it can make your software projects more predictably successful. I hope you enjoy listening in on our conversation. Hi, Olivia. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Jared, how are you doing?
Doing great, thanks. So excited to have you on the podcast and talk about serverless today. Such a big and important topic right now in modern cloud development. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this today.
All right. So you've probably seen this meme before on the internet, but there's this meme that says there is no cloud. It's just other people's computer, right? So
Yeah.
as that relates to serverless, I would say maybe that's also not true that there is no server. It's just someone else's server. So could you maybe define what is serverless or what architecture, what are we talking about when we talk about serverless?
Yeah, a really good place to start. So, common misconception is that serverless means you're doing things and there's no servers anywhere. But the reality is that there are still servers. What it means is that within a serverless approach, you are able to run code without needing to manage the underlying infrastructure compared to the way that it's done in more traditional environments. As a solutions architect, this is one of the things that comes up quite often when I may be having customer conversations and just wanting to, I never like to assume that anyone knows something or not. And so that's something I always want to get ahead of and making sure that people understand. Yes, when we start talking about going down this road of serverless, there are a lot of benefits to it, but you servers are still there. They're just kind of out of the picture and out of sight.
So it's more like from the developer's perspective, it's not that it's serverless, it's that as far as you're concerned, there's no server you have to maintain. Would you say that's a fair way to characterize it?
It really is, yeah, because when you think about using cloud services and as you expand your digital footprint, as it were, one of the questions you always have to ask yourself is, with where I am now and the skills that I have and the knowledge that I have, what's the difference between my current state and how to possibly get to this other form of technology? Like, what's the
Mhm.
knowledge gap? What's the skill gap? And sometimes when you think about a serverless approach, uh, people will assume, well, hey, because I don't have to manage servers, hey, I can just get up and start running right away and I don't have to think about anything with that. But
Yeah.
as we'll talk about today, there are some things that people will need to take into account. But one of the benefits there, I do feel, is that you aren't having to worry about learning all of these things that do go into more of your traditional server management
Mm.
because it can be a lot.
Yeah. No software updates or OS upgrades or these types of things, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's, I think those are really good examples, and it's twofold in that sometimes people may not understand what are all the factors that they need to be concerned about. Like they may not realize, software patching, OS updates, other types of fleet management. And then even if they do know what the list of things may be, they have to worry about, well, I don't know how to do those things. So, yeah, it's a lot that can go into that. And I can definitely understand how that is part of the appeal with many people looking to a serverless approach.
Everything in engineering is a trade-off, right? There's something you get and there's something you give up usually.
Yep.
Usually you can't have your cake and eat it too with technology or engineering. So with serverless, what do you see as the things that you're getting and the things that you're maybe having to give up or trade off in exchange for those things?
Yeah, I think one of the main benefits that I've seen with developers starting to take a serverless approach would be a lot more productivity. Because instead of, let's say you're a developer, you're trying to run something in the cloud, you, on the one hand, have to deal with figuring out your code. And then on the other hand, you also have to deal with the whole infrastructure, which is a whole other thing. In this case, it really can help someone to focus a lot more on the code part of it and not have to spend as much time focusing on the infrastructure management, frees you up for other things as well. And I think another benefit, depending on, of course, if it's a good use case for serverless, you can see some cost savings with that.
Mm.
Best example I can think of when I explain the concept of serverless to customers and they're trying to understand, well, what does this what does this mean? What does this look like? I give the example of like an image processing application. Let's say you've got an application where a user will upload an image, and then there's maybe a certain set of transformations that need to be applied to that image or needs to be tagged or cataloged in some way, passed down the production line, and so on. With a type of serverless approach, you're able to configure this in a way where when you have users who are uploading pictures that need to be processed, the application's running, the code is running, it's doing that, and that is when you're paying for the use of said application. And when you don't have users who have pictures to process, it's essentially shut off. And
Mm.
that I feel when you think about that in just very general example, but hopefully that helps to illustrate a bit of what the cost savings could be when you think about
Yeah.
keeping
So
something
if
turned on when you don't need it.
you have a server or even a VM, you're paying for those cycles. Obviously, a physical server, it exists even when you're not using it completely.
Yeah.
Rarely are you using 100% of the processor cycles, and it's just sitting there being a thing that you own and whatever maintenance expenses. And same for VMs, right? They have these processor
Hmm.
cycles that you pay for, and so with serverless, it's
Hmm.
essentially the cycles that you need, and then you don't pay for the cycles that you don't need, right?
Right, right. And I think especially when you look at developers, independent developers, I work with game studios, so there's a lot of indie studios who are trying to figure out ways that they can get their product in front of people, but without having to break the bank. And when they're trying to even test something and see, can I get this to work? Starting with a serverless approach and building it in that way and only bringing in the pieces that you absolutely need to connect together can be really
Mm.
beneficial, not just, I think, from the cost savings perspective, but even just, I'm going to step away from the technology for a bit and get to the like the human side of it, which is
Mm.
people love being able to see that something that they have built is actually working.
Yeah.
And this isn't to make a blanket statement of things in serverless will always work more easily than they will in a traditional development environment. But I think that from what I've seen, when developers go in and take a serverless approach and figure out how to get that working to suit their use case, the first time you get that success error code or the success message, it feels really good, and you want to keep
Yeah.
doing that a little bit more.
I've certainly seen, especially in larger organizations, there can be, the development team, and then there's maybe a separate DevOps or infrastructure team that's actually handling putting that stuff live and configuring servers and so on. And you can
Yeah,
have days, hours, days, or weeks between you writing the code and getting to actually see it running somewhere. And when you talk about the cloud and serverless specifically, you could write an API and have it live in seconds, which is pretty cool.
yeah, it really is. And if we want to talk about the trade-offs to that
Mm.
to balance it out a bit, like,
Sure,
so what's the catch here?
sure.
I would say there's a few things I want to highlight with this. I guess the first thing I would suggest would be the learning curve that can be part of it. And it's not to say that serverless is impossible or inherently difficult to learn, but I feel that one of the trade-offs can be when people who may already have some cloud experience go into it with the exact same kind of mindset that
Mm.
they would have taken when they were working with a more monolithic application. That can be a trade-off because sometimes you as an architect may not even realize that you're doing something that doesn't align with best practices
Mm.
until you start getting a bunch of errors, until you start seeing that your performance is having an issue, until you start getting a pretty high bill and you're wondering where that's coming from. So knowing that you do need to learn a little bit more can be part of it. Also, a trade-off can be the concept of a cold start, which I know
Mm.
a little bit as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a dirty word, I guess, when you're talking about serverless, right?
Yeah.
It seems like if you search Google or Reddit or Stack Overflow or something like that, you'll see a lot of people having problems with that. So part of that is probably that mindset that you were just talking about. They're thinking about serverless or functions as a service in a way that is really an old-fashioned way of thinking about monolithic applications, and they need to adjust their thinking as much as their code. But we'll come back to that. First, before we do, though, I want to ask you a little bit more about this trade-off question. Also gets into some applications that are a good fit and some applications that maybe aren't a good fit. So what criteria would you use to decide that? If you're writing a new application or maybe migrating a legacy application and you're thinking, do I want to use AWS functions or Lambda, or do I want to use Azure functions or something like that? Or
Hmm.
do I want to use something more traditional? How would you go about thinking about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you want to ask that question because it is something that, as a solutions architect, I know that I have these conversations with customers, and when they come to me and say, "Olivia, let's go serverless," my first question is, "What? Why do you think that you want to do that?" I'm not saying no, but like, where's this coming from? And then it
Yeah,
becomes a question of, all right, what are you trying to do? And here's some of the criteria that I would consider to determine could this be a good fit or not. As I mentioned, the customers that I work with are game development studios. So probably in
mm,
my work, the biggest, the most common use case that I see for uh, serverless architecture is related to game backends and
mm,
using something like a Lambda function as an intermediary between other services, connecting to like API Gateway, DynamoDB, and so on, carrying out functions that relate to all the things that go on behind the scenes with video games that you never even think about that make the magic happen,
sure,
like leaderboards, updating scores, and so on.
sure.
Um, I think,
Subscriptions, all kinds of stuff to check, right?
yeah, exactly. Yep.
Hmm.
Things that are often also like running in the background, like a processing task. Things that also you can use for some data workloads as well. So, like I've seen it being used for social media analysis in
Mm,
ways. The approach I take as a solutions architect, which often surprises people because of the very technical work that I do, it is very non-technical in that I suggest to people sit down with paper and pencil and draw out what it is that you're trying to do. And often, if you
mm,
are trying to take something from point A to a point B and like carry that over, that can be a good use case in general terms for a serverless approach. However, with that being said, the other side of this, where I have the conversations of maybe what you're trying to do is not ideal for serverless or something involving Lambda. Speaking from my experience with AWS services, that would be when you have the ability to allow services to integrate directly with one another without the need for an intermediary like Lambda. And this is a very a thing that can come up quite a bit because I think once someone starts using a service like Lambda um, uh, to fulfill like a serverless purpose, it can be really easy to want to use that for every other thing that comes up. when you realize, oh,
Yeah.
wait, these services can already talk to each other without needing to throw Lambda in there. And so that can become a little bit problematic. Like, even from a security perspective, you're increasing your potential attack surface, and so on.
Right.
Um, One other thing I would say that could not be a good use for serverless or like a Lambda function. Thinking again with my experience with Lambda, knowing that it has that timeout period after 15 minutes.
Mm.
So if you've got something that needs to run for longer than that, then that's when you want to look at this and say, all right, what are some alternatives that we could possibly do that would be a better fit for
Hmm.
this? What you don't want
Yeah.
to do that I've seen sometimes is try to make a service uh, bend so far to fit your use case when there's other options that would be a lot less stressful.
Sure. It's the old if all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail
Yeah,
analogy,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so back-end services like maybe some sort of a nightly sync job or something like that. That's if you just take what you have today and it's running for a half hour or heck, 5 hours every night or something like that.
Yeah.
If you just take that and just pop it over into a Lambda, it's not going to function well because it's going to get cut off every night, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's so important to. Um, we haven't started talking about metrics yet, but I think it's relevant to surface right now that when developers are making these decisions about the tools that could be the best fit for them, a lot of these decisions can need to be determined by the actual metrics that they're seeing. And
Mm.
so, what I recommend to people is give something a try, see how this works for you, and don't just go off of, well, I feel that this is going to be good. No, I
Yeah.
personally am a very data driven individual. So, I would say dig into your metrics and see. Are you getting the type of performance from this that you're looking for? And if not, then that might be a sign to you that you need to shift something around.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned that, which brings me to another question I wanted to ask about, which you kind of alluded to a minute ago too, which is kind of thinking about, if you're thinking about your application as a monolith and then you're deploying it in a very distributed way, like functions, you're going to maybe get yourself in some trouble. And one of the areas where I've seen that the most is with things like monitoring and debugging. When you
Hmm.
have a monolith or you're used to working with a monolith, debugging is fairly simple. You can maybe step through your code and everything is communicating with each other directly. When you get into more of a distributed application like functions, now it's a little harder to figure out what happened. So what recommendations do you have for monitoring and debugging?
Yeah, okay. I will try to be brief here because this is one of those topics that, if I'm not careful, I can end up talking about for a very long time. So that was
We might
try
have
to
to do
try to,
another episode just about this.
like Olivia talks about monitoring parts. All right. So the way that I would go into this would be to see, like, first, figure out, and I'm just going to go with Lambda for the example for this. Um, Figure out which monitoring tools are available to you. That's step one. Get a sense of, like, when you go into the AWS console, what types of graphs and data are just going to be available to you by default, and also what are the pieces of information that are going to be the most important for you to capture. One of the issues that I've seen with monitoring can be data overload, and that sometimes people are so inundated with the amount of data that they're getting from their functions that they just kind of gloss over it, and then it becomes something that they don't want to look into. But I would say if you're looking
Hmm.
into something like even just some of the factors like your error rates, your request latency, your CPU utilization, even if you start with just a few handful of items and are intentional about monitoring those, that's going to ensure that you've got some level of insight into what is going on there. So, the other part of this is that when it comes to debugging said issues, then you need to ensure that you have set yourself up in a way that's going to make that easier. So, In other words, you're going to want to give yourself a good foundation before you ever have any problems with your functions. And some of the basics that I talk with my customers about that I say to them, like, I'm so sorry if this seems really basic, but these are the things that I know can make your life so much easier down the road. Even things as simple as versioning your functions and
Mm.
ensuring that you're not just using one version of the same function over and over again, and you're not keeping detailed records of what was changed and why. When it comes to debugging, because in a serverless approach, you're looking at separate pieces that are connected together. You need to be able to have some understanding of not just what you have in place, but how those pieces are connected together. So if you're using a service like AWS X-Ray to assist you with debugging and tracing a request that's gone through, um, it's not going to do all the work for you. I think this is
Mm.
the biggest thing that I would emphasize to everyone who's listening, which is that use the tools that are there to support you, but then also ensure that you and your team have some clear understanding as to what your cloud spread is. And I can't think of the right word right now. I can't think of the right word. Like attack surface, but not in a security
Mm.
approach, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Um,
Yeah.
and really just making sure you understand the connections between those pieces. That I think is the biggest
Sure.
part of serverless debugging that can be news to people who haven't yet done this before.
So what I hear you saying is that monitoring and debugging really shouldn't be an afterthought. They should be something you're thinking about at the beginning when you start getting into cloud development is how am I going to do this?
Yeah.
And there's a way to write your code that is, let's say, taking advantage of what's available to you there and going to make your job easier. And there's a way to do it that makes your life miserable.
Yeah, because it's so easy to start building and start putting pieces together without taking the time to pause and ask yourself, okay, what are the pieces that are going to be most helpful for us? And I would say, with just giving another AWS example, what I tell my customers with a service like CloudWatch, it's used for monitoring. If at any point you are unsure as to what a particular metric does, look into the documentation. I know that it's not the most fun thing to do, but having some understanding of all of the different pieces of data that can be captured about your function it's so helpful to
Yeah.
really understand what's going on there. Some things, even I as a solutions architect, I never touch, but at least I know that I can go to that documentation and refer to it if needed.
Yeah. Another area that I know is a challenge in the cloud just in general, especially for developers that aren't familiar with it or as familiar with it yet, is this like cost overrun. Like we all have heard maybe these horror stories that you hear on the internet about somebody who maybe didn't know exactly what they were doing and they turned on some service and all of a sudden they're getting a bill for thousands of dollars or worse, tens of thousands of dollars at the end of the month. When it comes to creating specifically lambdas, and other serverless technologies like that, what do you think are some good like rules of thumb for cost saving strategies and best practices to make sure that you're not getting one of these surprise bills at the end of the month?
Yeah, very good question. First, I would say it's important to understand for Lambda, for example, how you're being charged for that. And so I wanted to make sure I was speaking correctly to this. So I've got some notes to refer to because even I sometimes I
Sure.
know there's like it's a three-pronged approach as to what the cost comes into. So for Lambda,
Yeah.
your costs are going to be determined by the number of executions and then also your duration of the execution and how much memory is being used, and then your data transfer. So when you think about cost savings and performance, there's a little bit of push and pull, the give and take. Like on the one hand, if you are making the decision to increase the memory of your functions to get better performance, you have to make sure that you understand that has an effect on the cost of running said functions. So I think that when it comes to cost savings with this, not just for serverless, but for anything that's within your cloud environment, it's essential to use the tagging resources that are available to you to keep um, your your resources better organized. So let's say you and your team are working on a variety of projects, project A, B, and C. Use the tags that are available to you to make it so that you are organizing, in this case, like your Lambda functions according to those projects. So that if you're seeing then that your Lambda usage for this account is sky high or more than you want, if you don't have tags enabled, it's going to take you a little bit more work and effort to figure out exactly which of
Mm.
these functions are most contributing to that cost. Um, does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, it almost sounds similar to your answer with monitoring and debugging. Like there's a way to learn the tool and use the tool that makes your life easier later to figure out where your costs are coming from, and there's a way to use it where you're maybe more haphazard and it's difficult when you get a big bill.
Yeah, and again, I'm speaking with people who are just getting started with building their project, it's so exciting to want to build and do things. The last thing that anyone wants to hear in the beginning is, "Hey, make sure that you're tagging your resources," because that's not fun.
Nothing more fun than that, right?
Yeah. But then when I showed people an example of, hey, here's what it looks like when I have a billing report that is that's pulling in resources that have not been tagged, and here's one that does show you that breakdown, it's like night and day. And then people are like, okay, how do I do some
Hmm.
tagging again? Because this is really important. Um, and also with a service like Lambda, another way to save costs would be so two things with this. One would be to use our the AWS service, Compute Optimizer, which allows you to analyze your compute usage, not just for Lambda functions, but also your EC2 instances. It also shows you like EBS volumes, like maybe if you are over or under provision. A lot of times, if you are needing to figure out ways to save costs, it could be the case that there's ways to save that you didn't know of because it can take some time and effort to do that manually. So using a service that automates that can be particularly helpful. And sometimes what you'll see is that in addition to that, getting into like a compute savings plan is a way to save as well.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
this is where like I spend a lot of time in the AWS pricing calculator, which again I know is not the most fun thing, but once you take some time to sit down with it and put in the information, recommendation here for cost savings is the more information that you put in there to calculate what your scenario is, the more accurate that prediction will be.
Yeah. Information in equals information out, right?
Exactly.
Okay. That's very helpful. Well, we mentioned the other, I would say maybe biggest headache for developers who are first getting used to serverless types of compute for the first time, which is the cold start. And I'm curious if you have any tips on that as well. How can somebody maybe think differently, write their code differently to try to mitigate the effects of the cold start?
Mm. Yeah, that is a question that comes up quite a bit, like you said. And
Sure.
um, what I've seen that works generally well for helping to mitigate that would be in Lambda, the concept of provision concurrency. And with provision concurrency, so this is giving you a certain number of pre-initialized environments to have your function run in. And with that, it can be particularly helpful for mitigating the cold start. But as with anything else, I feel that in order for someone to truly see the benefits of that, you don't want to just go into your account one day and say, all right, I think I'm having some too many cold starts. Let's fix this. I'm just going to throw a random number out there of provision concurrency and see if that sticks, because that's not going to work. So I think that if you are looking into using something like provision concurrency to help offset that a bit, definitely ensure that you're looking at your actual metrics and seeing what that
Yeah.
balance might be there.
Yeah. So don't just guess at that number. And that number
Yeah.
basically is like a minimum number of instances. Is that kind of a fair way of thinking about it?
Yeah, so it's the number of pre-initialized environments that you have. I've got like
Right.
I wish I could share my screen because I've got like a slide that I typically show that has a good way
Yeah.
of visualizing this. But it's like the best way I can describe it is that it's like pre-warmed ovens that are there for you.
Right.
And so that
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
you're able to have those ready to go.
Yeah. That's a good analogy for it. Okay. We've learned a lot here about serverless, which is amazing. But I am curious. The last question I like to ask all of our guests, and I'm very curious to hear what your answer is what other topics should we be talking about for making software projects more predictably successful, or who else should we be talking to? Any answers for that one?
I do. My answer for this is the concept of psychological safety. And let me ask
Hmm.
you, are you familiar with this? If not, I can explain it a bit.
I don't know if I know it by that name, but it sounds like something I might be familiar with. But why don't you describe it?
Yeah, let me make sure I'm not giving a rambly definition of this, but psychological safety, at least how I define it, it's the concept by which you as an individual feel that you are in an environment where there is safety, there is trust, there's a sense of camaraderie. You as an
Hmm.
individual feel capable of taking risks without
Hmm.
being penalized for that. You feel comfortable with asking for help when you need it. And so the reason that I bring this up is as a non-technical topic is that especially in the world of software development where people need to work together as a team, uh, you
Yeah.
can work as a team, but if there's no psychological safety, or if there's a very low sense of psychological safety amongst team members, what this can lead to is people shutting down, not reaching out for help
Hmm.
when they need it. And that in itself can introduce more problems in the development pipeline simply because people didn't feel that they could say something when they needed to.
Yeah. Yeah, like a real innovation governor that you could put into a system is having people not feel like their contributions matter or like it's safe.
Yeah.
We had an episode last year about building trust in teams, which I
Oh,
think is
nice.
kind of right along those same lines. So
Hmm.
I love that suggestion, though. That's great.
Yeah.
Uh, anything else to add to that?
Nothing else I would add to that, but if we do have a minute, I would love to talk just very briefly about security, because that's
Yeah, please.
yeah. So with serverless and security, it is one of the areas where, again, as we talked about, with people feeling, okay, I don't have to manage my infrastructure. Sometimes a misconception can be, oh, that must mean I also don't need
Mhm.
to manage anything with security, and
Yeah.
that's not the case. I just want to make sure that people are aware that even in a serverless
Mm.
approach, you're going to want to ensure that you are prioritizing security, that you're not just setting your IAM roles and policies with the most open level of access just so that you can
Mm.
ensure that something works. So make sure that
Mm.
you have an emphasis on security, continue to familiarize yourself with the most recent list of OWASP vulnerabilities, and refer to documentation for additional security best practices.
Yeah, that's great advice. And that really applies to any technology stack. But in a technology stack like the cloud, where part of the appeal is there's less to manage, I think it's important to underscore that
Yeah.
less to manage, but not nothing to think about at all, right?
Yes.
Especially with security. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Olivia, this has been fun and very informative. I really appreciate your time talking about serverless with me, and hope we can have you back sometime again in the future.
Yeah, would love to. Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts, focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.